Thank you for taking a little break with us. It was really great to have Nick with us. He presented something very similar at the NMC Summer Conference, and I was blown away and thought, well, this would be a great presentation for today's event. So let's shift gears and talk about another very hot topic beyond digital strategy, which is crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing refers to a set of methods that can be used to motivate a community to engage with the museum by contributing ideas, information, or content that would otherwise remain undiscovered. Our panelists have worked with various forms of crowdsourcing in their work environments and will engage in a discussion about their involvement with this movement and its implications for the museum of the future. And now I'm going to introduce each one of our presenters or panelists so they can tell us a little bit about themselves and the projects they're working on in their space and how they define crowdsourcing, or how they take that umbrella term and really specify it for the type of work that they do. So first off, we have Jon Carfagno. He's the Director of Learning and Audience Engagement at the Grand Rapids Art Museum. Take it away, Jon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. As Alex mentioned, yes, I'm the Director of Learning and Audience Engagement at the Grand Rapids Art Museum. And responding to the question around how we define crowdsourcing, I tend to roll with Ross Dawson, who is a thought leader in the space, who wrote a really, really great book, Getting Results from the Crowd. And I like his definition because it is open-ended enough that it allows us to have some conceptual understanding of the term, but then we can also drill down a little bit deeper into the various forms of crowdsourcing. So Dawson simply states that crowdsourcing is tapping the minds of many. And now thinking about how that relates to our work in Grand Rapids, I'll return, I guess, back to our field with Lori Bird Phillips, who I think has done a great job in addressing some of the various forms and incarnations of crowdsourcing. One thing that we've done in the Grand Rapids Art Museum is collaborate with our local division of AIGA in a collaborative social entrepreneurship business model for a program that's called Design Briefs, which I think really embodies the idea of community sourcing, wherein we asked entrepreneurs in our very rich startup environment to share ideas that they had on an online platform that was then evaluated by thought leaders in our local region and funneled up into a program wherein these ideas were addressed by a panel of experts, and then the crowd came together to, in the form of breakout sessions, to share coaching around strategy by design to develop these ideas. And then the other form of crowdsourcing that is a really, really big part of what we do that is mentioned in the NMC Horizon Report is that we literally stand at the center of Art Prize, which is a not-for-profit here in Grand Rapids that puts on one of the largest radically open art competitions in the entire world, where our community has the opportunity to award $280,000 in prize money for works of art that they see as reflective of warranting those awards. And that, to me, I guess, is what Lori Bird Phillips would designate as contributory crowdsourcing and really crowd voting.
All right, thank you, Jon. And I have a personal connection. I came from the Grand Rapids area in Michigan, and they didn't have anything close to the Art Prize when I grew up there. So I always am fascinated with the development of that project across the city. I think it's really a great. Next, I want to turn to Ed Rodley. Ed is the Associate Director of Integrated Media at the Peabody Essex Museum. Take it away, Ed.
Okay. In terms of definitions, crowdsourcing is really a term I don't like for some of the reasons that Jon got into. I think we tend to use it to stand in for a much broader range of things that we're interested in. I think Lori Bird Phillips' continuum of participation is sort of a good model to think of. Crowdsourcing is a very specific piece of that spectrum, but generally when I'm talking about working with our audiences, I generally tend to frame things just in terms of participatory experiences, and I'll get into a little bit more about some of my concerns about the term crowdsourcing and the way, particularly, it gets addressed in the museum community. Some of the resistance one often gets to to semantics rather than substance. Particularly crowdsourcing, where it gets tied up with the whole notion of authority. Who has the authority to have a voice and why? Oftentimes can get in the way of actually doing anything. So I'm particularly conscious about how one frames projects, especially projects that have not yet gotten off the ground. You know, where the whole point of the exercise is to get to someone saying, yes, go ahead and do this. What you call something becomes sometimes it seems like more important than it ought to be, but yeah, I don't like crowdsourcing. Participation. Let's talk about participation and participatory experiences.
That's a good point, Ed.
Yeah.
I think that really shows the maturing that's happening with this idea of crowdsourcing. You know, and I think that's something that we'll kind of dive into a little bit deeper today. Is kind of finding another way to call these things. Last but not least, we're joined by Sarah Stierch. She's a Susan B. Miller Fellow at the Berkeley Center for New Media. She's our West Coast correspondent for today. And so take it away, Sarah. How do you define this not so attractive word crowdsourcing in your area?
Well, I'm so glad that Jon and Ed spoke before me, so they were able to get it all out there, and I get to slack off on defining it or dwelling too long about it, I suppose, because I feel pretty strongly about definitions in general for things as a person who's always liked to go beyond definitions myself, like many of us do in the culture sector. My own work has stemmed starting in Wikipedia and working with cultural institutions, which I call GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, to see how they can partner with Wikipedia, which Lori, who we've talked about, who's a colleague of mine and many of ours, has sort of recently defined as, the epitome of all things participatory, as the most successful participatory project that's even struggling on its own to sustain itself. Because I think as we try to define crowdsourcing, the world is maybe getting a little burnt out on being used as a free knowledge resource. So I'm curious on how institutions like many of yours can partner with these websites and these programs and these new media experiments to further sharing knowledge within your institutions to provide the public greater access to those resources. Two of the projects that I work on, I'm posting links in the chat box here, are organizations partnering with Wikipedia, which Ed has participated in recently at the Peabody, Essex, and Open GLAM, which is a broader international movement to open up cultural heritage institutions around the world, data-wise and public-wise. I have a traditional curatorial background, and I never thought when I went back to college after 10 years of being a makeup artist and DJ that I would be opening up my eyes as a curator who loves research and being in the depths of the basement doing that research, to be opening up my eyes to sharing my own research with the world and giving up that ownership so more people can access it. And I think participation, sharing is one of my favorite words, frankly. And as Marit Sanderhoff says in Denmark, sharing is caring. So I'd like to see how we can explore sharing our heritage and getting more people to care about it by participating in that project and process.
Great. Well, thank you all for introducing kind of how you're using crowdsourcing concepts in your environment. As I did in the last panel, I want to bring it back kind of to the Horizon Report, and we really focus on these movements and technologies and their impact for teaching and learning. So why is this important for teaching and learning? I'll turn this over to Ed. Why do you think that this participatory movement that we're involved in, what impact does that have for you on teaching and learning?
Yeah. I think probably the biggest impact that I'm seeing at the moment is all of these larger trends are agitating towards making us in museums think more about our relationships with the people we used to call the visitors differently. I just came out of a 2-hour-long brainstorming session where we were addressing exactly this topic. Where 10 years ago we might have been thinking about, we have exhibition X coming up in 2 years, and we're going to develop assets A, B, and C for the exhibition. Now we are forced to confront the reality of we're going to have an exhibition coming in a couple of years. What's our strategy for interacting with our audience throughout the whole run of the exhibition? So if it's a temporary exhibition, multiple venues, but also thinking about the digital and the on-site not being two separate things, but really being just different ways of interacting with the same content. Crowdsourcing, the way the world is going at the moment is that it is much more participatory. People have an expectation that they have more agency than they used to have, and we, as a profession, I think, are starting to acknowledge the fact that the audience actually has something that's worth hearing, and we're kind of dumb not to listen and to try to create experiences that allow for relationships that are longer than the visit. In the past, as someone who works in exhibitions primarily, it was all about between the time they walk into the gallery door and they walk out the gallery door, and whatever else happens wasn't really your concern. It was somebody else's concern. But now this idea that you can actually have really rich long-term relationships that will span multiple visits. You can have relationships with people, nowadays, thanks to the global internet, there are people who will never physically come to your venue who you still might have deeply valuable relationships with if you go find them, you go say something that is interesting to them, and you actually give them the opportunity to say something and acknowledge that you've heard what they've said. So getting out of the broadcast mode and getting into the discourse mode, I think, is probably one of the most interesting things going on these days.
Yeah, good point about that more active participation, and this idea that we continue to go to return to of this physical and virtual visitor, and how these lines are blurring, and how we're beginning to consider the importance of each. Next, I want to turn over to Jon. Why is crowdsourcing, the ideas involved in crowdsourcing, important for teaching and learning? What kind of experience do you have as the head of education down at the Graham?
Well, I think Ed did a wonderful job talking about this idea of a comprehensive customer experience with our exhibitions and our offerings. So I think I am going to answer your question through a different lens, and that is, yes, as a former director of education, I'm really interested in this idea of the role of museums in 21st century skills. And I think at some point we're going to have to stop calling them 21st century skills. Now we're 15 years into the 21st century. But I really like the work that Tony Wagner has done around defining the ways in which education is evolving and the role that museums can play in proliferating public value through the skills that we teach. So Wagner talks a lot about critical thinking and defines it as the ability to ask the right questions at the right time. And I think as crowdsourcing generates more and more content from a variety of sources, the ability for museums to help our audiences to understand which opinions or perspectives can inform learning are really, really important. And I also think the ability for museums to open up the space, 21st century skills, communication is a big, big part of success in the emerging marketplace. And when we open up the spaces for our audiences to articulate their perspectives and their understandings and the meanings that they're making from our exhibitions, everybody wins.
Thank you, Jon. And I'll turn it over to Sarah. What are your thoughts on this question on teaching and learning?
Well, I think teaching and learning is such a generic phrase for what could be a million things. The first thing that popped into my head was how universities, such as the Berkeley Center for New Media and other, which is ran by University of California, Berkeley, and other venues are utilizing crowdsourcing platforms to not only teach new media skills in creating these platforms, but also utilizing websites like Wikipedia and education programs where students say they'd rather write a Wikipedia article than write a term paper. and they do better at it, and they get better grades, and it's sort of that new version of these online communities being utilized to educate and teach. But I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to, on the flip side of what learning and educational values and so forth, is teaching and learning as staff members. I mean, I have been told to my face, curators and archivists and all kinds of interesting people, don't use my work in your work. I don't want my content and the research I've done to be a part of this crowdsourcing thing or this Wikipedia thing or this open knowledge thing. And on the flip side, I've had people say, this is really awesome. I'm overwhelmed. Please sit down and tell me what this is all about. How do I get involved? How do I learn these skills? And I think it's sort of a survival of the fittest. I mean, I like to think that those staff members and directors and so forth who are open-minded and willing to take risks, as Nick mentioned in his keynote, are going to be the survivors and the successors and rock stars of whatever crowdsourcing evolves as. And I think kind of giving up our control and learning how to be open-minded about how we work with the public, because we are public institutions and we're here to educate the public, is a big challenge, and is something I can't wait to see how it goes in the future. So.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We have a question from the audience I'd like to highlight here. See if anyone wants to chime in on this. And this is, does the 80-20 rule work with crowdsourcing? If so, how does it affect interactions and content creation?
The 80-20 business rule. You sound like my father, an old school businessman. I think, well, and again, my main research work has been around Wikipedia and its related websites, and anyone who's kind of followed the trend of Wikipedia over its 12-year existence might be familiar with the fact that a very small percentage of the people who contribute to Wikipedia are high content producers, people who write the big articles, people who write the articles you see featured on the front page of Wikipedia every day and are really prolific. And that's only about 10 to 20% of the contributors. And on the flip side of that, only between 10 and 20% of the contributors to the website are women. So you have a systemic bias in the content, and you have a kind of a challenge of sustaining a community of people who are forever going to be creating quality content, not just little changes here or there, or monitoring the back channels to build policies and rules and manage each other. And I think as crowdsourcing gets bigger and broader and institutions start to think of who is the owner here of the content, of the concept, and of the process, it's trying to figure out how to entice people and to retain people and to get quality content out of them. Especially in projects like tagging and things like that I see in collection systems, like on the Smithsonian Serious database. I just go, who does that? Probably only 10 to 20% of the people who actually visit the website. But maybe it's different. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyone else, John or Ed, wanna chime in on that question?
Yeah, I'll take a whack at it.
Okay.
So one of the examples I was going to talk about is for a project that we're working on at the moment, and if you bust it out of the crowdsourcing label, so what counts as participation is one question. And to get back to was it John who mentioned Laurie Phillips' continuum? This notion that there are all kinds of different ways that people want to participate in online discourse. If you look at any social media platform, say like Instagram. Is posting a picture on Instagram participation? You might say yes, you might say no. Is commenting on somebody else's picture on Instagram participating, yes or no? For us, what we're much more focused on at the moment is trying to figure out activities that can hit many different levels of potential contributors, so making stuff available for people who just want to have things to look at, providing opportunities for people who want to engage in conversation and commentary, giving them a place to do that, as well as providing tools and repositories for the smaller but not much more vibrant, but the smaller but the people who have a outsized impact, that 10 to 20% who are actually out there doing tons of stuff, providing them with both the tools and repositories to showcase what they're doing and provide those other people who are the commenters and the viewers a way to be able to see what they're doing. is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about these days. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Turn over to John. I'm going to switch up to the next question we have here. Is what lessons can we take away from our current program, our current programming involved in this area? Any lessons that you're taking away? Because Art Prize is not a program of the Grand Rapids Art Museum. It's a citywide program in which the GRAM is a exhibition site. But what kind of lessons have you taken away from your involvement in that citywide event?
Well, I would say countless, almost too many to enumerate, but I'll share some. One thing that we need to consider is that Art Prize is very much an opportunity for us to explore extreme cases, in that, we're a mid-sized museum, about 25 full-time staff members, and during the 3 weeks of the Art Prize competition, we see about 165,000 visitors, which is nearly half of our annual yearly attendance, and that's in 3 weeks. So one of the things, and this is going to seem really simple, but we have learned to watch our audiences and be comfortable with iteration. And now we're in year 6 of the competition. Our traffic flows have continued to emerge or re-emerge and be reimagined. And it has also been a really great opportunity for us to learn how to work cross-functionally, in that in order for us to accommodate the volume of traffic that we see in those 3 years, in those 3 weeks, curatorial, guest services, security, we all need to be at the table from March until September, and then for twice-a-week meetings during the 3 weeks of the competition. So I think the biggest takeaway is the significance of cross-functionality, which I know is something that in the field we're all thinking about an awful lot, and how we can use the modalities of thinking and working together that help us to be successful during those 3 weeks across the other 11 months of the year.
Yeah, that's a big thing to pay attention to. Is something that 3 weeks out of a year is half of your attendance. That it seems like, okay, we're in July right now. Art Prize is September, so I'm sure you're gearing up for a very, very busy time right now. How about Sarah? What kind of lessons are you taking away from some of the projects you've been working on?
Well, a number of the projects, gosh, there's a lot. I've written a few case studies about them too, so I can post links if people are interested. I've done projects in regards to Open Glam and Glam Wiki with the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, who released, oh my gosh, over 20,000 high-resolution images to Wikimedia Commons, which is a free media repository online. And I've also done work at the Smithsonian Institution in 2 different units and the Library of Congress regarding this work. Thanks for sharing those links, Alex. And the biggest challenges are often getting buy-in, again, because staff members are usually pretty freaked out by this idea of sharing and allowing it to go out in the world, and especially on Wikipedia where anybody can edit your content. It's a trust issue, I think, and board members are often even more confused because they're usually of a more mature set, so they aren't as comfortable with some of these new media technologies and this crowdsourcing and the Wikipedia. So having to do lectures and having to gently brainwash people is often one of the biggest challenges I've had, and many of my colleagues and staff members who I've worked with have had. And also finding funding. One of my biggest issues as somebody who's been one of the forerunners in regards to these partnerships, alongside people like Lori and Dominic McDevitt Parks, at the National Archives here in the U.S., is finding funding for this. Wikipedia is a project that's been maintained and developed by volunteers for the majority of its existence. However, to have somebody develop these relationships and partnerships costs money. It's not something I have the ability to do as a volunteer in my 30s with a master's degree, when I could be doing other opportunities like I've been finding these days in consulting and working with nonprofits in different sectors. So the biggest challenge is finding people who are willing to take risks And yes, I did work at the Archives of American Art, and in the chat room there, and fund these projects. People assume again, oh, you're involved in crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. Pardon me. You must do it for free. And you're like, well, I also have to pay rent, and I'm going to be spending like 40 hours of my time a week doing this project. So funding would be really awesome. And they go, okay, I can't do it. We'll just try to train some overworked staff members to do it instead. So for me, I think funding and buy-in are the two biggest challenges. So, and I could go on and on and on all day about it, like many of you could probably.
Well, thanks, Sarah. How about you, Ed? What kind of lessons have you learned from some other projects that you've been working on in the participatory realm?
Well, to riff off of what Sarah started saying, one of the things I've spent a lot of time in the past year doing has been providing informal professional development for the staff at the Peabody Essex Museum for a number of reasons. Not just the specific projects that I'm working on, but just sort of a general perception that by and large, you have the staff that you have, and you have these brand new tools, almost all of which post-date the formal education of everybody. Even the 23-year-olds who are just starting now were using tools that were not even in existence when they were in college. So nobody has the kind of formal training in these things that we think of being necessary to use traditional tools. So we have been pursuing a model that was started by Carolyn Royston at the Imperial War Museum in London, this notion of basically a drop-in professional development program that she called Computer Club, just to give people very targeted bits of information, enough to let them bootstrap themselves into using digital tools. And that for me has probably gotten rid of 85 to 90% of the resistance that I would have encountered a year ago. The kind of stuff that Sarah was talking about, I'm not so sure about this, whatever the this is, whether it's Wikipedia or Twitter or should the museum have a blog. A lot of that just comes down to people not having had the time to explore these things and not feeling like they know enough to be able to make a decision. So just being able to give people, in our case, if they're like 1 hour, 1.5 hour long sessions at lunchtime with pizza. Here's what Twitter is. Here's how professionals use it. Here's the capsule history of blogging. Here's how we intend to use it at the museum, and here's how we want you to help us. That has been enormously helpful. For our Wikipedia editathon, I spent a lot of time giving the same talk on what is and what isn't Wikipedia to people at the museum, and by doing that beforehand, that probably got rid of almost all of the roadblocks that I had anticipated encountering before we started off on the project. And I think for any crowdsourced, any participatory project like that where you're trying to do something new and different, the thing that people often skimp on is doing the kind of horizontal coalition building that's necessary. It seems, certainly to me, in my experience, I often feel like, God, why do I have to keep saying this to people? But if you don't, then that's when you wind up running into the wall. The more you can actually explain what you're trying to do and want to do to people throughout the institution, the more likely you are to be able to have a sufficient mass of institutional buy-in behind you to get it off the ground. And that's not even necessarily buy-in from the administration. When we've been running these talks on trying to encourage people to be more active on social media, probably the most popular session we had was one with our staff photographers talking about how can you take better pictures with your camera phone. So it wasn't really, we weren't looking to get a particular outcome out of it. We're just trying to get people more comfortable with the idea of you all have this in your pocket. You're all taking pictures anyway. We know you are. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually be tagging them in such a way that the museum can know you're doing it, that you can be part of the conversations that we're having with our audience, and the audience can see that, oh, the Peabody Essex Museum is actually comprised of people. There are all these people who actually work at the museum. And to try to personalize the institution in a way that's really hard to do in other ways. Social media is really great at putting a face and a voice and a name. to things, and that's something we're really focused on. Is trying to surface that there is no institutional voice. There is this collective of voices that comprise the Peabody Essex Museum, and trying to give them as much agency as we give the audience. So it's not just listening to the audience. It's actually figuring out what to replace the generic institutional voice with. How do you actually get those voices inside out, as well as getting the outside voices in?
Yeah, that's a great example. We use an example from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Australia called the MCA Now, where they installed video displays within the museum, and they encouraged their staff to use Instagram, so that this conversation was happening from the inside, from the outside. It was being brought from the virtual world into the physical space, and so there was a conversation being enabled between staff and visitors in a physical and virtual space. So yeah, it's really really interesting way of engaging the staff as well. Before we move on to the next question, I know Sarah wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, in regards to what Ed started off saying in that last second there when he was talking, was about internal education. And he started to talk about newer, younger people in their 20s coming into the museum and maybe not being as familiar with certain tools or being super familiar with certain tools. And I went back to school a little later in life and found all of this just a few years ago, when it was sort of getting still really underground. I was being told by my professors at one of the biggest and best universities in the world for museum studies that my ideas were crazy and I was nuts, and I still get told that sometimes, and that's okay, but it was really frustrating. And in a very traditional program, I was doing business administration and all these other things that were really great and have proven invaluable, but people thought these ideas were nuts and that social media was not a place where museums needed to be. And this is still the case when I meet museum studies students at conferences around the world. They go, what are these ideas? Wait, Twitter and Glam Wiki and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going, you don't know about this? Do you not know what a hashtag is? And they're like, no, that's not. I'm collections management. I don't need to know any of those things. Social media freaks me out. I have a Facebook account, though. And I go, okay, we've got a lot of work to do. And I think the evolution of museum studies programs is going to be a critical component, and doing what Ed's doing, and I'm sure John's probably doing similar things, and myself and others out there doing these internal trainings are valuable for everybody at all levels. And it's really scary when you're in a museum technology class and 90% of the people don't know what Twitter is and don't use Twitter, and we're afraid to make Twitter accounts. So we need to crack people of that fear and show them that it's not that scary of a place, and that it's worth experimenting with sometimes.
Thanks. And John, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, I think what both Ed and Sarah just shared reminded me of something that Nick commented on in his keynote that really resonated with me. This whole idea that when we're hiring, if people can't do what's happening outside of the world, should they come inside? And I think one of the things that our prize has been able to do really, really well, because they're not governed by the same orthodoxies of the museum field, is to understand the context within which they're operating. Grand Rapids is a region that has the right size, the right philanthropic base, and also the longest history, I think, in terms of Michigan for understanding innovation and big ideas. So all of these things came together to make our prize really, really successful. So I think as we're continuing to think about crowdsourcing and staffing and what it takes for museums to be active and successful in this space, we need to take a look at what's going on in the world around us and then bring that into the museum if it's not already there.
Yeah. So this is proving to be a really interesting question. So I'll take it back to Ed.
Yeah. One thing I would just add to that to follow up on all of this. To get back to some of the things Sarah was saying, yeah, I mean, literally some of the conversations we had in our social media 101s would run along the lines of, how many of you have Facebook accounts? All the hands go up. How many of you like the museum's Facebook page? Maybe half of them go up, and you ask them, like, well, why wouldn't you like your employer's Facebook page? And people would say, well, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to, or, nobody said I should. And this plays out across every single platform you can imagine. So that kind of really low-hanging fruit, informal professional development becoming more an integral part of the culture, I think, is really the thing that is going to make the biggest difference now, moving forward. So one of the things that I often hear is, oh, we just gotta, wait till the digital natives show up, and then, all will be better. Once people are here who understand how all these new technologies work, then life will be better. But to me, that sort of smacks of kicking the can down the road a little bit, because the way things have been going now, the technologies we're talking about 5 years from now haven't even been invented yet, probably for at least another year. So the people just coming into the profession now will be as ill-equipped to deal with what happens 5 years from now as the current crop of museum professionals are equipped to deal with digital technologies, unless institutionally we shift our culture to be one that makes this kind of incremental, continual development part of everybody's life. I mean, that's really, for me, I think, the only sustainable way forward. You can't get rid of everybody. You can't hire only the latest, greatest crop of people. You have a staff that you've invested in. How do you grow them while at the same time continuing to take in new expertise and new skills? And the answer to that has to be, we have to think differently about what it means to be a museum professional, and when are you done learning, right? The 20th century model was you go to school for a very long time, and then you're done learning, and you're a professional, and that knowledge you learned in school carries you all the way through to retirement, and that just isn't the case anymore, but we still act like it is. And that is something that is going to be a critical thing that needs to be solved in the next year, 2 at the outset.
Preach it.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep it with you, Ed, for this next question, because we're kind of thinking about how this is going to transform over time. So how do we see these ideas that we're kind of are starting to mature? How do we see them transform over time?
Well, okay. So one thing I see as someone who worked in a science museum for a very long time and now works in an art museum, one of the most interesting fields for growth, I think, is looking at what it means to curate differently. I have the feeling that in the 21st century, successful curation is going to be much more of a community management kind of skill as much as it is a domain skill at the moment. Where we are so interested in sharing scholarship in a participatory environment, that means talking to people about what you know a great deal about, and hearing what other people want to know about that subject, being open to the idea that you don't know everything about anything, even if you studied it your whole life, and that out of those conversations come richer content. So, if you think of some of the earliest crowdsourced applications, things like Old Weather, or the New York Public Library's latest thing where they have people looking at fixing street maps of New York City, they're generating knowledge that a curator probably would never get around to doing. And that knowledge is allowing more progressive curators to think differently about what they do and the kinds of questions that they can ask. So John Russick at the Chicago History Museum recently wrote a really interesting piece on Medium about a photography app that they're working on that would geotag photographs of Chicago. So their collection is all about Chicago. He is the chief curator. He's interested in all of this information about Chicago. And they don't have geolocation for all of the photographs. They know it's Chicago, but they don't know where. There are lots of people in Chicago who probably know more about the history of Chicago visually than the staff at CHM. And if you were able to engage with them to help you geolocate all of these photographs, not only would the object information for those objects be enriched, but that corpus of knowledge of having all of these geolocated objects would allow him as the curator to look at his collection differently. If he knew where everything came from in Chicago, you could visualize that. And his supposition was that if he did visualize it, he would be very displeased with the results, because you would see the inevitable results of racial and class divides. There are probably parts of the city that are underrepresented and parts of the city that are overrepresented, and that would never have occurred to him in a million years using 20th century tools, because it's not something that would have even entered the realm of possibility. But now it becomes something that's sort of dead easy. So I think more and more you're going to see curators thinking differently about what it means to curate their collections, and actually talking to audiences, global audiences, as sort of a day-to-day foundational aspect of their work.
Thanks, Ed. How about you, John? How do you see these ideas, especially the Art Prize and at the Graham? How do you see some of the ideas that you're learning transform over time? How do you see maybe the impact of that month-long citywide program on your museum over the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, I anticipated the question. I've been thinking a lot about this. And, in West Michigan, like I said, we have a long legacy of design innovation at the center of our economy. And with crowdsourcing right now, one of the things I've been really interested in is this idea of what is a business model for the future, 20 years down the road. Because right now we have many different forms of crowdsourcing, like we talked about. For crowdfunding, there's Kickstarter. For open knowledge, there's Wikipedia. For paid microtests, we have things like TaskRabbit. For issue reporting, you see ClickFix. For collective geomapping, CrowdMap. So what would happen when all these systems begin to play together? And there's a really great article, I'll pop a link into the Unified Chat from Wired magazine, about what the world will look like when all these different forms of crowdsourcing come together to create a comprehensive crowd-driven economy, and what will the implications be on that for museums in terms of fundraising, how we develop our offerings, and how we continue to remain relevant within the context that we're operating in.
Great. How about you, Sarah? How do you see these ideas transforming over time?
Oh, well, I had one of the things that Ed was mentioning, having went from a science museum to an art museum, and it popped something into my head about science and most bird watching. So birding. Okay, I'm a bird watcher. I love birds. I go to places and get up early in the morning like an old retiree, and I take photographs of birds, put them on Flickr under a free license, and sometimes they end up in books and websites and crazy places. And I'm also a member of the Cornell's Ornithology Labs, a proud card-carrying member. And I always keep waiting for the day when someone from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is going to be on one of these panels. Because bird watching is considered sort of like the original crowdsourcing project. Citizen science was doing its thing before we came up with this beautiful term, crowdsourcing. And I think we can learn a lot from citizen science and from Cornell University's amazing projects. I mean, they call me to confirm if I've really seen certain birds. How cool is that? I don't have museums calling or emailing me when I post something on Flickr or respond to tell them there's a typo on their website or whatever. I get yelled at if I make a wrong edit to their Wikipedia article instead. So I think we can learn a lot from citizen science and the partnerships and the trust that science has put in the public in regards to what we contribute to them. What were we talking about, though? The future? Is that what we were talking about? I do think we're going to start seeing more education within institutions. I think we're going to see more embracing of trust. I think we're going to see curators have that new title. I threw out community curator in the Unified Chat, which is kind of work that I've been doing for years now, as a community organizer in the open knowledge and free knowledge sector. Organizing all these people to come together to contribute this knowledge and work with cultural institutions. And I love the example of Chicago and of curators sort of saying, okay, who's going to have the time to do this and who knows all about it? That retired group of guys, at the Veterans Center who've lived here forever and know all about this one specific neighborhood. let's go tap into that. There's a lot of opportunities there, and I think thinking creatively is going to be a key. And everybody who's here has that opportunity to be one of those leaders in thinking creatively and putting their trust in the public. It's just going to take some time, and hopefully people will get paid to do it. So.
All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I kind of just want to throw it out there and have some closing thoughts from our panelists. I'm going to bring it over to Ed. Really, what kind of closing thoughts do you have about the future of this for museums? Kind of continuing it down to maybe the ideas of redefining what crowdsourcing is. That's one thing that I've kind of picked up from this discussion is it's an umbrella term that encompasses so many different ways of engaging, and it may come across negatively in terms of just taking from individuals. Give me, having the crowd give you money or give you ideas, or and from this conversation, I understand that there's this back and forth. It's this reciprocity, I think, is in there that will develop and mature over time. But I'll just give you a couple minutes to talk about kind of some takeaways or some closing thoughts from you, Ed.
Closing thoughts. Okay. Big thought. Regardless of whether you call it crowdsourcing or participation or what have you, probably the biggest thought would be ignore it at your peril, because it's the way the world at large is going, and it will only get more that way over the next few years. So where we are, I think, at the tail end of one of these cycles of having existential crises, like what is the point of being a museum? We tend to have these episodically. Not being aware that you have a global audience is probably the biggest recipe for being irrelevant there is nowadays, and not being cognizant of the fact that there are opportunities that are passing you by if you try to just carry on with business as usual is the biggest one. I would say probably the other big one for me is this notion that these kinds of participatory experiences really do allow you, in a way. I've been in museums now for almost 30 years, and we've talked about wanting to have long-term relationships with visitors pretty much since I started. I'm willing to bet we were probably having those conversations even earlier, but now it really stands a chance of being a reality, where you can have rich, varied relationships over very long time spans. So getting out of what I've always referred to as sort of the theatrical model of, you do all this work for the show, and there's a date on the calendar when the show opens, and then the show is done and you're done with the show, as opposed to more of the gardening metaphor that dominates the way sort of the web works, and particularly the way that social media and participatory experiences work, where you're never done. It's never open. You make something, you tend it, you work on the parts that are currently thriving. If there are parts that aren't, maybe you try to go in and fix them, but it's never finished in the same way that a garden is never done, right? They're either being actively tended or they've been abandoned. And that switching to that modality is going to require some fairly profound transitions in the way that we think about our work, the way we approach our work, and the way we approach our audience. And that's probably the other big thing. You can sort of see there from here, but we're still very 20th, 19th, 18th century in our structures and our habits, and getting out of that is going to be an interesting ride.
Yeah, that's a good point about this. It's never done, and that kind of reminds me of like digital publishing and this idea of an exhibition kind of being like a book in a traditional sense. You put all the pieces of the book, boom, you have your opening is the complete book, and then you're done. And it isn't done. It's with the internet, you're able to, and with social media, with crowdsourcing, with many different tools, you're able to keep that living and be able to continue to mine that for further information. I'm gonna turn it over to Jon. What are your closing thoughts? I'm gonna give you a couple minutes just to just to give us your thoughts about this topic, the future of it.
Frankly, I couldn't agree with Ed more. I think, returning to this whole idea of context and the crowd economy, if museums aren't embracing this, they may need to evolve very rapidly or be ready to deal with the consequences. So if you look around right now, people are becoming more and more connected to one another. Innovations like Airbnb, people are now bypassing hotels because of their inefficiency and connecting with their social networks because it's more instant and more authentic. So I think that Ed's kind of clarion call is right on, that we need to be examining what is happening around us and then extrapolating further out into the future what is going to happen when all these different strands of crowdsourcing and social media come together to reinvent how we operate.
Thanks, Jon. And Sarah, I give you the closing thoughts for this session.
Oh, the pressure! I've been taking some notes here, so I'm not as much driven on theory as I am action. So I'm going to make a few calls to action with a little bit of theory, perhaps. Somebody had mentioned crowdsploitation in the unified chat, which I think is my new band name after this session. I love it. That happens a lot. I have been a victim of it, and I know many people who have been in the realm of crowdsourcing and free knowledge production. And so I just want to remind people to respect the public. And if that involves gamification of something, free membership, if you do all of this work, what do you get at the end of all of this, aside from some glorious satisfaction of feeling good about yourself that you helped somebody get credit for a job well done and paid at an institution where they're paid? So think about how you can respect the people who are helping to create this content and if they should get a benefit out of it. And are they really getting a benefit? And I think one thing we struggle with in the culture sector is evaluation and exploring how to evaluate these programs and what people really are getting out of it. If we assume they're getting anything out of it, what are they getting out of it? So let's evaluate it and respect them as we do it, of course, and get all that knowledge out of them. Training and relevancy, as we touched on, I think it's critical that institutions train their staff at all levels, from the cleaning staff to the directors to the board members, on what the heck this stuff is and how to use it. And it doesn't mean they have to use it, but as long as they can get a little more familiar with it. And of course, I think the pressure it should be also on our museum education programs to create relevant programs that aren't just about traditional methods, as both Ed and Jon have touched on, these old school methods that we love so much, because that's so much why we got into this, right, is to work next to those objects and to hang them on the wall and to move and design those exhibitions. But where is that relevancy going to take us in the next 100 years of being an institution, right? So training our students and our future museumists of tomorrow is very important, and also doing it at conferences too. Trying things out yourself. I had asked if anybody participated in any crowdsourcing projects, and I do know I'm going to participate in Grand Rapids this year, that's for sure, if I can do that from afar. So trying things out. Try editing Wikipedia for yourself. Try participating in a hashtag Instagram contest. Try the bird watching stuff. It's super easy, and you can download an app and report every time you've seen a rock pigeon if you live in New York or whatever. Try it and learn from it. And partnerships. All right. Oh, one more thing, my last thing, I'm sorry, is partnerships. I think we need more partnerships between cultural institutions and communities, cultural institutions and universities, and also better partnerships between our colleagues in Europe who are being funded federally to do these kinds of projects, such as Europeana.
Thank you, Sarah. And on behalf of the NMC, I want to thank Jon, Ed, and Sarah for their take on the many facets of crowdsourcing and participatory engagement. We're going to take a little bit of a break while we get our next presentation set up. So thank you, everyone.